Hey, first and second graders, now we're going on to chapter 5 of Our America, and it's called A Growing America. So, we're going to be looking for some of these words: national anthem, admiral, patriot, which means someone who loves, supports, and defends his country. So many years had passed since the United States had become a new country. Our country was beginning to grow. In 1812, our country was once again at war with England. It was important for our country to win this war because it would prove that America was strong. By August of 1814, the British soldiers had captured and burned Washington, D.C. Their next plan was to capture Baltimore, Maryland. To capture Baltimore, the British would have to destroy the fort that protected the city, Fort McHenry. This important battle inspired our national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. So, with whom was the United States at war in 1814? England. And after burning Washington, D.C., what city did the British plan to capture? Baltimore, Maryland. So, why do you think the British captured Washington, D.C. first? Well, it's because it was the capital city. Some additional information about the War of 1812. The United States was at war with England because British had interfered with our trade with other countries in Europe. They had blockaded our ports along the Atlantic coast, and they had also kidnapped thousands of our sailors and forced them onto British ships. So now we're going to be talking about the Star Spangled Banner and its origin. There was an American doctor named Dr. William Beans who wanted to help his country. Before the battle, he tried to arrest some British soldiers. The angry British took the doctor prisoner aboard one of the British warships. Dr. Bean's friends were worried about him. In a small boat, they sent a patriot named Francis Scott Key to talk to the admiral of the British warship. The admiral said he would let Dr. Beans go, but the Americans could not return to land for a few hours. The British were ready to attack Fort McHenry. They did not want Mr. Key to go back and warn the Americans at Fort McHenry of the attack. Mr. Key watched as the British shot bombs and rockets at Fort McHenry. He kept his eyes on the large United States flag flying over Fort McHenry. As long as our flag was still flying, he knew the English had not won. Some additional information about Dr. Beans and Francis Scott Key. Dr. Beans was very popular and highly respected, and he was a doctor. And after his capture by British, his friends were worried about him because he was also elderly. Francis Scott Key was well known. He was a well-known lawyer, and Dr. Beans' friends asked Key to try to convince the British to release Dr. Beans. Mr. Key and Colonel John Skinner, an official who arranged the prisoner exchanges, courageously boarded the British warship. At first, the British admiral refused to release Dr. Beans, and Key and Skinner had wisely brought letters written by wounded British soldiers who had been captured, and these soldiers reported being treated well by Americans after their capture. After reading these letters, Admiral agreed to release Dr. Beans. The Admiral realized that Key and Skinner had overheard attack plans on Fort McHenry and refused to let them return to Baltimore until after the battle. So who had the British captured during the war? Dr. William Beans. And who boarded the ship to ask for Dr. Beans' freedom? Colonel John Skinner and Francis Scott Key. So some other things to look for: rampart, perilous, which means dangerous, and gallantly, which means boldly. Night came, but in the light of the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air, he could still see our flag. It had many holes in it from the rockets and bombs, but it was still proudly flying. Then Mr. Key did not see our flag for a long time. Was it still there? At last dawn came. Through the morning mist he saw our flag. What a beautiful sight. Still on board the ship, Francis Scott Key began writing a poem. He called it the Star Spangled Banner. Later, when he was back on land, he showed the poem to his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law liked it so much that he had it printed. The poem became very popular. Someone noticed that the words seemed to fit an Old English tune. Soon, the Star Spangled Banner was sung everywhere. Many years later, on March 3rd, 1931, President Herbert Hoover signed a law making the Star Spangled Banner our national anthem. Francis Scott Key wrote 4 verses to the Star Spangled Banner. The first verse is the one you sing at school and hear most often. Some additional information about Francis Scott Key: he jotted down the words to his poem on the back of a letter during the attack. And after about 24 hours of continuous attack, the British realized they could not take the fort and they retreated. Key finished the poem when he got back to his hotel room, and the poem was sung to the tune of a popular British song. So when did Francis Scott Key realize that the fort had not been taken by the British? At dawn when he saw the flag. When did the Star-Spangled Banner officially become our national anthem? March 3rd, 1931. If the British had been able to take the American flag, with what would they have replaced it? They would have replaced it with the British flag as a sign that they had defeated and taken over the fort, and our country would look very different today if that had happened. So list some words that might describe how you would have felt if you had been in Francis Scott Key's place and had seen our flag flying over the fort over the battle, after the battle. Probably proud, excited, relieved. It's probably what I would feel. As you read the words, imagine you are on the ship with Mr. Key. What must it have felt like to wonder if your country's flag was still flying or if it had been captured by the enemy? Think how thrilling it was to see your flag, though tattered and torn, still flying. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. In the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? So we know that perilous means dangerous, and we are learning that rampart is a wall or a bank that serves for protection, as there were walls or banks around the fort. Okay, so why do you think we should stand at attention with our hand over our heart when we sing the national anthem? Well, it shows respect and honor for our flag, and since our flag is a symbol of our country, it shows that we also respect and honor our country. And we're going to turn the page. Okay, so if you visit the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., you can see the huge flag that flew over Fort McHenry. It is over 32 feet long and 27 feet tall. The British could not help but see our proud flag. It has 15 stars and 15 stripes. You will see 11 holes in the flag made by rocket guns on the British ship. And the flag has been restored, but it's still very fragile. It is kept at the right lighting, and it's safe in a safe, controlled climate so that it can be preserved for future generations. During the stormy battle, a smaller storm flag was flown. When wet, a larger flag would have weighed the pole down too much, which is why if there's a storm, that's why you wave a special flag. But a regular American flag you cannot wave during a storm. But in the morning, the storm flag was replaced with a flag that we can now see as the Smithsonian, and the flag that brought Scott Francis Key, great joy to see. So where can we see the flag that once flew over Fort McHenry? In a Smithsonian Institution. And how many stars and stripes did the Fort McHenry flag have? 15. So now let's talk about the origin of my country, 'tis of thee. The War of 1812 ended with America defeating England. The United States was at peace again. A choir master and organist named Mr. Lowell Mason lived in Boston, Massachusetts. He wanted a new song to teach the children at his church. He had found many German songbooks that were full of songs. There was just one problem. Mr. Mason could not read German, but he knew someone who could, his good friend Samuel Francis Smith. Mr. Mason asked Mr. Smith, "Please look through these German songbooks for me. If you find a good song the children can sing, write it in English." Mr. Smith began looking through the songbooks. The music to one hymn was beautiful. He stopped to hum the tune, then he began to think of his own words for the tune. So some additional information about Lowell Mason and Samuel Smith. Mason was called the father of singing among the children, and he is probably most famous for arranging the tune for Joy to the World, which Mason got from a famous composer, Handel, which you may have heard of. Mason wrote music or tunes for over 1,600 hymns. Samuel Smith had graduated from Harvard University and was attending a theological academy when he wrote Words to My Country, 'Tis of Thee, and Smith later became a Baptist minister. So what job did Mr. Mason have at a church in Boston, Massachusetts? He was choir master and organist. Why did Mr. Mason need Mr. Smith's help? Mr. Mason liked the songs that he had seen in German songbooks, but he didn't know how to read the German words. But Mr. Smith could read German. Turn the page. Finding a scrap of paper, he began writing the words to My Country, 'Tis of Thee. In a very short time, he was finished. Finally, Mr. Smith took his song to his friend. Would Mr. Mason like his song? Mr. Mason sent Mr. Smith a note asking him to come and visit the Park Street Church in Boston for their 4th of July children's program. The 4th of July came. Samuel Smith was surprised to learn that a front row seat had been saved for him. How surprised he was to hear a group of children sing the song he had written. This 4th of July in 1831 was the first time that My Country 'Tis of Thee was sung, but it was not long before Americans everywhere were singing it. This song actually became popular immediately, and it was often used as the unofficial national anthem before the Star-Spangled Banner officially became our national anthem. My Country 'Tis of Thee is also known as America, and the melody used by Samuel Smith is the same one for the United Kingdom's national anthem, God Save the Queen. All right, so on the next page, here are the first and last verses of My Country 'Tis of Thee. Before you sing them, read them. Think of God's blessings to our country, then sing out with a joyful heart. So we know My Country 'Tis of Thee, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. Of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Our fathers God to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright, with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King. So how does the second verse refer to God? As great God, our King. And what does the second verse ask God to do? Protect us by his might. Let's go ahead and turn the page. So now we're going to be moving into talking about America's pioneers. So as our country grew, Americans began to dream about going west. It wasn't unusual to hear people say, "Go west, young man, go west." Do you think you would have been one of those people who wanted to go west? So two of the words we're going to be looking for are frontier and pioneer. The United States was growing. More people sailed to America looking for a better life. More and more states were being added to our country. Big cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, and New York were growing bigger and bigger. Some men felt crowded and wanted to move on. They wanted to be surrounded by trees and land instead of people and buildings. They did not want to be fenced in. But where would they go? There was unsettled land in the West. Some people began to talk about moving there. Although today we think of the West as California and Oregon and Washington and Alaska, in the early 1800s, the West meant any land that was still unsettled. The West kept moving farther west as America continued to grow, and by 1900, settlers had pushed to the Pacific Ocean what was once called the West because it became known as the Midwest. So many settlers were attracted to the West when gold was discovered in California in 1848, and New York City had grown from 60,000 in 1800 to over 1 million people in 1860. Cities were crowded, housing conditions were often poor, and threat of disease was always a concern. These concerns were another reason some people wanted to move west. So name 3 cities in the East that were growing very large: New York City, Philadelphia, and Boston. Hardly anything was known about the West. There were no towns. This meant there were no doctors or stores. There were no sheriffs to uphold the law. There were many wild animals. It was a new frontier. The brave men and women who dared to move westward were called pioneers. A pioneer is a person who goes first and clears the way for the others who will follow. The first pioneers were men who traveled alone. Most of these pioneers walked. Some pioneers had mules to carry the few things they owned. What was the pioneer's main possession? His gun. With his gun, he could shoot his dinner and protect himself from danger. These pioneers prepared the way for whole families to move to the West. So who wrote the words to My Country 'Tis of Thee? Samuel Francis Smith. Who asked him to write it? Lowell Mason. What is a person called who goes first and clears the way for others? The pioneer. So who were the first pioneers and how did they travel? They were men traveling alone. Most walked, but some had mules. And why was the gun the pioneer's main possession? He used his gun for hunting and for protection. Why were there no stores, doctors, or sheriffs in the western frontier? Because it hadn't been settled yet. Turn the page. So we're going to be looking for Cherokee and pave the way, which means make a clear path. A pioneer of pioneers. In 1775, the land that makes up Kentucky was bought from the Cherokee Indians. At that time, Kentucky was a wilderness of thick woods. How could pioneer families travel through this wilderness? Someone would need to pave the way. While many Americans were fighting the war for independence, Daniel Boone became one of America's first great pioneers. Led by Daniel, 30 men with axes chopped a rough path from Virginia to the mountains of Kentucky. This rough path through forests and over mountains became known as the Wilderness Road. As the years passed, thousands of pioneer families traveled west. And some additional information about Boone. When he was a boy, his Indian friends taught him how to hunt, and he became an excellent hunter. At age 20, he joined the colonial army and fought in the French and Indian War. It was then that he heard about Kentucky and visited that region. At the end of Wilderness Road, a settlement named Boonesboro was built in honor of Daniel Boone. So from whom was the land that makes up Kentucky purchased? The Cherokee Indians. And who became one of America's first great pioneers? Daniel Boone. What is the name of the trail that Boone and others made that goes through the mountains from Virginia to Kentucky? The Wilderness Road. Westward ho! Thousands of families wanted to be pioneers. They traveled across the Great Plains. Many even traveled to the other side of the Rocky Mountains. Many families decided to travel together in wagon trains. Together they could help each other in times of trouble. A wagon master was chosen. He was a man who had made the long trip before. He knew the dangers of the trip. He knew where to hunt for food and find water along the way. It was his job to safely lead the families of the wagon train on their journey. The route over Rocky Mountains into the Oregon came to be known as Oregon Trail. This trail had been first blazed by fur traders. In 1843, one party of about 1,000 pioneers and 120 wagons went from Missouri to Oregon country. Most of the 120 wagons made it. An estimated 350,000 to 500,000 people came over trails to the west. So why did families travel west together? To help each other in times of trouble. And what was the wagon master's job? To get the families of the wagon train safely to their destinations. Could the wagon master guarantee the pioneers that they would arrive safely at their destination? No, there's no way he can guarantee, because there were many dangers along the way. Sickness, lack of food and water, weather conditions, dangerous people. There was lots of dangers on the way. All right, I'm going to turn the page. Packing for the journey. Because there were no stores along the way, pioneers had to pack their supplies. If their food ran out, they would starve. If they did not pack warm clothing and blankets, they might become sick. Food, warm clothing, and blankets could not be forgotten. Bags of flour and cornmeal, as well as coffee and salted slabs of bacon, were loaded into the wagons. Pioneers also packed kettles and coffee pots for cooking over the fire. Pioneers packed axes and nails to build houses when their journey was over. They also took plows to break up the ground and seeds to plant in their gardens. Pioneers had to decide how many cows to take. Sometimes a cow was tied to the back of the wagon, and after all these things were packed, there was hardly any room left in the wagon for other things. Pioneer women had to give away most of their pretty dishes and furniture. They had to carefully pick which special things they could take with them. Often they took their favorite books so they could teach their children to read. The men had to choose the animals to pull their wagons. Because an ox is much stronger than a horse, oxen were usually chosen instead of horses. So who were the people who dared to move to the American West? Pioneers. Who was one of America's first great pioneers? Daniel Boone. How did the very first pioneers travel? They walked. If you wanted to write a pioneer packing list, this is something you could do just for fun. It's a little list. Turn the page. And we're going to be talking about traveling west, and it's going to be a story about James and his sister Anna, and some words that we're going to be looking for are prairie and buffalo. Hello, my name is James, and this is my sister Anna. We are on our way west on the wagon train. We feel excited about this new adventure, but a little sad too. Saying goodbye to our friends was hard. Bumpity bump, the wagons rolled on, and soon we could no longer see our friends who stayed behind. We are so glad our friends Samuel and Martha are going west too. In fact, they're in the wagon right in front of us. Crickety creak, the wagon wheels roll over stones and through forests. Each day the wagon master leads us as far as he can. On rainy days, it's hard to get very far. Our wagon wheels sink in mud easily. On those days, we have to make camp until the ground is dry. Days have passed. Day by day, we moved farther west. Day by day, the land changed. The forest was gone. Instead, there were all kinds of flowers, bushes, and trees that we had never seen before. More days have passed. At last, our wagons rolled onto the prairie, and now there were hardly any trees. All we could see was tall prairie grass waving in the breeze. Sometimes in the morning, the wagon master sends my father and other men on horseback to hunt meat. There are prairie chickens and rabbits, but what we really hope for is buffalo. A large buffalo would be plenty of fresh meat for everyone. It would taste so good after days and days of salted bacon. Turn the page. You should have seen Anna's eyes the first time she saw a buffalo. From nose to tail, a full-grown buffalo can be over 10 feet long. The wagon master told us that a buffalo weighs about 1,000 pounds. Buffalo have a pair of horns like cows, but their brownish hair is long and coarse or rough. Anna and Martha giggled. The buffaloes have beards. The other children laughed too. The wagon master told us that the buffalo is the largest American animal. The Indians hunt the buffalo too. They eat the meat and use the buffalo skins to make clothes and tents. Do you think we'll see an Indian? We asked. You'll probably get to see one before long, said the wagon master. The next day as the wagons rolled on, we did see an Indian. He sat proudly on his fine horse and watched the line of wagons pass by. He seemed to get smaller and smaller as we watched him from the back of our wagon. Each day at noon, the wagons rolled to a stop. My mother and the other women climbed out of the wagons and began to prepare lunch. We climbed out of the wagons too. Samuel and I helped feed and water the animals. Anna and Martha stretched their legs and ran. Samuel and I ran too after our chores were finished. How good it felt to run after sitting for 5 hours in the wagon. Turn the page. You're it, cried Samuel as we began a game of tag, but suddenly the game stopped. There were several small holes in the ground. I wonder what lives in there, Anna asked. In another hole not far away, a small furry animal popped out to stare at us. From another hole, out came another. Samuel and I tried to catch one, but the small animals always popped back into their holes. They are prairie dogs, children, said the wagon master as he walked by. This is a prairie dog town. Suddenly we saw a black shadow moving over the ground. Pop, pop, pop. Every prairie dog disappeared into its hole. We looked up to see a hawk circling the prairie dog's town. The hawk watched the holes. Too bad, Mr. Hawk. You'll have to find something else for your dinner, I laughed. It's time for our dinner, shouted Samuel. Then off we ran for a dinner of leftover buffalo meat, cornbread, and molasses. As soon as everyone finished, we got back into our wagons. I wonder what else we will see today. This land is full of surprises. The wagons rolled on. Bumpity bump, creakety creak. What is the type of land called that has hardly any trees, just tall grass? Prairie. Name the large animal that lived in the prairies and provided fresh meat for the pioneers. Buffalo. What tiny animals lived in their own towns on the prairies? Prairie dogs. How do you think prairie dogs got their name? I think they probably got the name prairie dog because they live out in the prairie and they kind of look a little like dogs without the big long tails. Turn the page. So now we're going to be talking about, they're going to be looking for the word corral, a closed-in area. The pioneers had to work together and help each other. At night, the wagons formed a circle. This made a fort for protection. It also provided an area to corral the cattle. The corral would keep the cattle from wandering off or being attacked by wild animals. As the pioneers traveled westward, many of them put their trust in God for protection. Perhaps as they left the Great Plains and headed into the Rocky Mountains, they were reminded of the Lord's constant help. And in Psalm 121, verses 1 through 2, it says, I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. In the evening, the pioneers gathered around the campfire. The children ran around and played games such as London Bridge and Leapfrog. Then someone usually got out a fiddle, and everyone joined in singing. Maybe you have heard this song before. Did you know the pioneers sang it? So, Pawpaw Patch. I don't know the tune. Where, oh, where is sweet little Nellie? Where, oh, where is sweet little Nellie? Where, oh, where is sweet little Nellie? Way down yonder in the Pawpaw Patch. And you can read the rest of the song if you would like. Now we're going to turn the page. Skip to Maya Lou, you probably know. Fly in the buttermilk shoe, fly shoe. Fly in the buttermilk shoe, fly shoe. Skip to my Lou, my darling. Skip, 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 skip to my Lou. Skip, skip, skip to my Lou. Skip, skip, skip to my Lou. Skip to my Lou, my darling. All right, so now we're going to be looking for the words discouraged and determination. Those are two things that are opposite of each other. And determination means working with a decided purpose. Although it was an adventure, pioneer life wasn't easy. Wagon wheels broke. Some wagons turned over. Others got stuck in mud. Sickness was the biggest problem pioneers faced. Most of the time, there was not a doctor or medicine to help them. A few families got discouraged. Some turned around and went back home, but most families kept on going. These pioneers showed great courage and determination. Every day meant new adventures, but also new hardships and hard work. Pioneers were just too busy to stop and think that with each step they took, they were building a great country, America. If you were moving west with pioneers in a covered wagon, what do you think would be your greatest adventure? Turn the page. So we're talking about America the Beautiful. And words you're going to be looking for are Colorado, spacious, and burro, which is a small donkey. By 1893, many wagon trains had crossed the Great Plains to the west. That was the year a teacher from the east, Catherine Lee Bates, spent the summer in Colorado. One day, she took a trip to the top of Pikes Peak, a very high mountain in Colorado. How was she going to get to the top? First, she rode in a wagon. Then, when the wagon and horses could go no further, she rode a burro for the last 6 miles of the trip. When she reached the top, she saw great mountains, rolling valleys, and a beautiful blue sky. The words to a poem began to fill her mind. She called her poem America the Beautiful. Later, a magazine printed the poem. The people who read the poem liked it very much. They asked if the words could be put to music. At last, Miss Bates found a hymn tune that seemed to fit her poem. As you sing the first verse of America the Beautiful, pretend you are with Miss Bates. You are looking at the high mountains and the valleys around Pikes Peak for the very first time. And before I read the words to America the Beautiful, I want you to know some additional information about Catherine Lee Bates. She taught English at Wesley College. She went to Colorado to teach summer classes at a college in Colorado Springs. While there, she and other summer teachers went to the top of Pikes Peak. A monument was erected on top of Pikes Peak in honor of Catherine Lee Bates and America the Beautiful. And Pikes Peak is over 14,000 feet high. It is one of 53 mountains in Colorado and that are over 14,000 feet. They are known as 14ers. Today, visitors can take a cog railroad to the top of Pikes Peak, and they can drive to the top on paved road, or they can hike to the top, which is actually a 26-mile round-trip hike, which would be like doing a marathon. So here are the words for America the Beautiful. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. I'm going to turn the page. So who wrote America the Beautiful? Catherine Lee Bates. What famous mountain did she visit? Pikes Peak. What state was she visiting when she went to the top of the mountain? Colorado. So down here, you're imagining drawing lines to match each song title with a picture that reminds you of the song. So Yankee Doodle with the drums, the Star Spangled Banner. He's watching the flag. My Country 'Tis of Thee is him writing the words of the German song, and America the Beautiful. So now we're going to be talking about a difficult part of America's history, okay? And we're going to be learning about something that came from this difficult time of America's history called the Underground Railroad. And it says there are some very difficult parts in America's history. One of those difficult times dealt with slavery. You've probably learned what slavery is from some of your Bible stories. Do you remember how Joseph was sold as a slave into Egypt? Slaves had been brought to America during colonial times. As our country grew, more slaves were brought to America. But many Americans who valued their own freedom disagreed with slavery. Some spoke out against slavery. Others helped slaves escape to freedom through the Underground Railroad. So here are some leaders that are really important to know. Harriet Tubman is one of the most well-known people of the Underground Railroad. William Still and Thomas Garrett. We're going to turn the page. The Underground Railroad was not really a railroad, nor was it under the ground. When I was a kid and I learned about the Underground Railroad, I did imagine it as a tunnel, and then I was dismayed when I found out that's not what it was called. That's not why it was called the Underground Railroad. But it was a secret way that many Americans helped slaves escape to freedom, and it was probably called a railroad because each safe house along the way to freedom was called a station. And the people that lived there were called station masters, which would be the terms you would use for a train and for the railroad. The people that helped slaves get from one station to the next were called conductors. Since most of the slavery was happening in southern states, the Underground Railroad was a journey north all the way to Canada. Many Americans worked together in the Underground Railroad. One of them was an escaped slave named Harriet Tubman. She and others helped a great many slaves safely escape to freedom. And if you ever want to look to see what an Underground Railroad station might have looked like, you can go to the Levi Coffin House in Fountain City, Indiana, and go check that out. One song that you may have heard of is Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And because the deep longing those in slavery felt for their freedom, many of their songs were a way of crying out to God for help and comfort. These songs are called spirituals. They tell about God and His love and are enjoyed by many Americans today. So Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. These are the spiritual words that connected with the slaves' daily lives, and they were a means of expressing their love for God. As slaves began to learn about Christianity and the Bible, they identified with the Hebrew people who had been enslaved in Egypt, but were led out of slavery by Moses, and some of their songs were about deliverance. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Turn the page. So now we're going to be talking about our country argues. And so the word you're going to be looking for is argues in Union, the United States. As Americans were moving westward and more states were added to the Union, trouble began to break out. The people in the northern states and the people in the southern states began arguing with each other. Many people in the South believed that each state had the right to make its own laws about slavery and other things. Soon the southern states began talking about separating from the United States and forming their own country. But the North insisted that no state should be allowed to leave the Union, and many were upset about the slavery in the South. What would happen now? Our country needed a great leader. So now we're going to be talking about Abraham Lincoln. On February 12th, in 1809, a boy was born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky. His parents were poor farmers. Young Abe Lincoln was kept so busy in the farm that he was not able to go to school much. Instead, he learned all he could by reading books. As he grew older, he worked at different jobs. He was a storekeeper and then a postmaster. Later, he taught himself law and became a lawyer. Because he was known for being an honest man, people called him Honest Abe. They knew that they could trust him. Finally, after serving in Congress for a while, Abe Lincoln decided to run for president of the United States. He thought that our country must remain one great nation or it would become weak. He was elected president in 1860. Abraham Lincoln knew that the arguments between the North and the South were hurting America. He also felt that America could not be strong if not everyone could have freedom. So, some additional information about the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. The South did not want Abraham Lincoln to be elected president because he wanted to preserve the Union and because he opposed slavery. They said they would leave the Union if he was elected. After the election, the Southern states began to leave the Union. They formed their own nation, the Confederate States of America. They elected their own president, Jefferson Davis. So where was Abe Lincoln born? A log cabin in Kentucky. What jobs did Abe Lincoln have before he became president? Storekeeper, postmaster, lawyer, and congressman. Why did President Lincoln want to preserve the Union? He thought our country would become weak if it were broken apart. So although he tried to stop the arguing, fighting broke out. A very sad time followed when our country fought the Civil War, North against South. Sometimes this war is also called the War Between the States. American soldiers fought on both sides of the war. The South fought for states' rights. The North fought to keep our country together. In the end, the North won, and the United States remained one nation. President Lincoln had kept the country together. He made plans to help the people of our country to become friends again. So some additional information. The war began when Confederate forces fired on Union-controlled Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Relatives were sometimes fighting on opposite sides of the war, even brother against brother. Civil War lasted for 4 years. Towards the end, Abraham Lincoln was elected president again. On January 6, 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which eventually freed all the slaves. He said, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong." Abe Lincoln told people in the South, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." After war, he worked to get people of the North to accept those from the South as their brothers again. So what is the Civil War also called? The War Between the States. What happened at the end of the war? The North won, the United States remained one nation. Only 5 days after the war was over, President Lincoln took his wife to see a play. A terrible thing happened there. An actor sneaked into the theater box where a president sat and shot him. Our country mourned the death of this great leader. People remember Abraham Lincoln as a great patriot who led our country during a very troubled time. To honor Lincoln, many towns, schools, and roads have been named after him as a memorial to him. But perhaps the greatest memorial to Abraham Lincoln is the special place Americans have for him in their hearts. Though February 12th is Abraham Lincoln's birthday, many Americans celebrate his life on President's Day. And if you were to visit our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., you would be able to see the Lincoln Memorial. So then we are going to be talking about Memorial Day, which we celebrate on May 30th. And each year on the last Monday in May, Americans honor those who have died while protecting our country's freedoms in war. Many Americans decorate graves with beautiful flowers. Let's learn about the very first Decoration Day. 3 years after the Civil War, beautiful Mayflowers were blooming in the South. On May 30th, a group of ladies from the South picked many beautiful flowers. They decorated the graves of soldiers who had died in the war. Some Northern soldiers have been buried in the South. The kind Southern ladies also decorated their graves. So after which war did the ladies place flowers in the graves of soldiers? The Civil War. What did the Southern ladies show by putting flowers on the graves of the Northern soldiers? They were showing kindness. The hearts of the Northern people were touched. In the years to come, May 30th was called Memorial Day. At first, Memorial Day honored only soldiers who had died in the Civil War. But since then, there have been other wars in other countries where Americans have fought and died. They died protecting the freedoms of other people, as well as our own country's freedoms. Memorial Day now honors anyone who has bravely fought and died for our country. Many people also decorate the graves of their loved ones on Memorial Day. Memorial Day was first called Decoration Day, and it is believed that the last Monday in May was chosen for this holiday because flowers are blooming then in most parts of the country. So when is Memorial Day celebrated? On the last Monday in May. And how do Americans decorate the graves for our war heroes? By placing flowers on them. So why do you think Memorial Day was first called Decoration Day? Well, probably because the graves were decorated with flowers. We'll turn the page, and now we're going to be talking about the last holiday for this chapter. It's called Veterans Day, and November 11th. So on Veterans Day, we honor all Americans who have served in our country's military. A veteran is a person who has served in the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, or Coast Guard. Some of our country's veterans are still living, but many are not. Some of those who have died were killed while they were fighting for our country. On November 11th, many towns have Veterans Day parades. Sometimes veterans who are still living march in these parades. So number 1, which president worked hard to keep the North and South together? Abraham Lincoln. When is Abraham Lincoln's birthday? February 12th. On which holiday do Americans honor those who died in war while protecting our freedoms? Memorial Day. And on which holiday do Americans honor all those living or dead who have served in our country's military? Veterans Day. So some additional information about Veterans Day. It honors all those who have served in our country's military, both past and present, while Memorial Day specifically honors veterans who are no longer living and gave their lives in service of our country. Veterans Day is a good day to let those men and women who are currently serving or have already served know how much we appreciate them. Many currently serving are sacrificed time away from their families to serve in our country. So what is a veteran? A veteran is someone who has served in the United States Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, or Coast Guard. And when is Veterans Day? November 11th. So guys, that is chapter 5. Great job.